What would you do if you found a terrified little girl tied up in the trunk of a stranger's car? For Micah, a homeless boy with nothing to lose, that moment changed everything. But what he didn't know was that this little girl wasn't just anyone. She was the daughter of a billionaire. How does a chance encounter lead to a bond so deep? It changes the course of their lives forever. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The city of Atlanta, Georgia, was alive with motion that evening. Neon signs buzzed above diners and convenience stores, their glow casting long shadows across the bustling streets. The chatter of families enjoying dinner, the rhythmic hum of passing cars, and the occasional laughter from a nearby cafe created a symphony of urban life. Yet, just a few blocks away, in the quieter alleys, another world existed, darker, lonelier, and far less forgiving. Micah Harris knew these streets well. At just 15 years old, he had learned to navigate their complexities with the skill of someone far older. His oversized jacket, patched in several places, hung limply from his wiry frame, a testament to the many nights it had shielded him from Atlanta's unpredictable weather. Tonight, like every other night, his mission was simple: find food, survive, and stay unnoticed. Micah crouched behind Jim's Southern Diner, a local spot known for its hearty portions and busy evenings. The warm, greasy aroma of fried chicken and collard greens wafted through the air, teasing his empty stomach. He scanned the area for the diner's trash cans, hoping to find leftovers. His breath hitched as he spotted a bag that had just been tossed out. Quickly he darted forward, grabbed the bag, and retreated to the shadows before anyone could notice. Pulling apart the crumpled paper bag, Micah's heart sank slightly. Half a burger, some fries, and a few uneaten cornbread muffins. Not much, but enough to stave off hunger for tonight. He sank down onto a milk crate, his shoulders slumping as he took his first bite. As he chewed, Micah's mind wandered to a time when life had been simpler. His parents' laughter filled his memory. A warm, sunny day at Piedmont Park, his mom teaching him how to throw a frisbee, and his dad grilling hot dogs. The memory was vivid, almost tangible, until it wasn't. The sharp contrast between that life and his current reality hit him like a wave. His parents' deaths had left a void that no amount of resilience could fill. Shaking the thoughts away, Micah focused on the present. His survival depended on staying sharp, not dwelling on the past. Then, a sound interrupted the quiet alley. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a muffled cry. Micah froze, his instincts kicking in. Slowly he turned his head toward the source of the noise. Parked just a few feet away was a sleek black SUV. Its tinted windows reflected the faint glow of the streetlights, giving away nothing of what was inside. The sound came again, a soft whimper, followed by what sounded like a slight thud. Micah's pulse quickened. He glanced around, his mind racing. The alley was empty except for him and the mysterious SUV. Could it be an animal trapped inside? A hurt dog, maybe? He crept closer, his footsteps light and deliberate. As he neared the vehicle, his eyes caught a small gap in the trunk's lid. Biting his lip, Micah leaned in, straining to see. His heart dropped. Through the narrow opening, Micah caught a glimpse of something that made his stomach twist. A pair of wide, terrified eyes staring back at him. For a moment, he froze, unsure if he had imagined it. But then the eyes blinked, quick and frantic, as if begging him to do something. He leaned closer, his heart pounding against his ribs. The dim light from the street lamp barely illuminated the inside of the trunk, but it was enough for him to see the outline of a little girl, no older than 6. Her pale face was streaked with dirt and tears. A dirty cloth was tied tightly around her mouth, muffling her cries, and her small wrists were bound with rough fraying ropes. She wriggled slightly, her movements restricted by the cramped space. Micah's breath hitched as panic shot through him. He stumbled back a step, his mind racing. What the hell was this? Who would do this to a child? He glanced around the alley, his senses heightened. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every distant noise a sign that someone was coming back for her. The girl whimpered softly, the sound barely audible but filled with desperation. It snapped Micah out of his daze. He crouched next to the trunk, his hands shaking as he fumbled through his pocket. He needed something, anything that could help. His fingers closed around the rusty screwdriver he always carried, and he pulled it out, his knuckles whitening as he gripped it. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice trembling but determined. "I'll get you out of here. Just stay quiet." The girl's eyes locked onto his, wide with fear but also something else, a fragile sliver of trust. Micah felt a surge of responsibility like he'd never known before. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. Someone had left her here, tied up and terrified. And if he didn't act now, who knew what would happen to her? He jammed the screwdriver into the trunk's lock, his hands fumbling as he worked. The tool slipped, scraping against the metal with a screech that made his skin crawl. He paused, listening for any sound that might signal danger. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the distant hum of the city. "Come on, come on," he muttered under his breath, his fingers slick with sweat as he adjusted his grip. The girl let out another muffled sob, her small body trembling visibly through the gap. The sound pierced through him, driving him to work faster. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. The screwdriver slipped again, and Micah bit back a curse, his frustration mounting. He glanced over his shoulder, paranoia creeping in. The alley remained empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone could appear at any moment. Finally, with a faint click, the lock gave way. Micah exhaled sharply, his relief short-lived as he carefully lifted the trunk open. The girl flinched at the movement, shrinking back into the corner of the small space. Her tear-filled eyes met his, filled with equal parts fear and hope. "Hey," he said softly, crouching lower to meet her gaze. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." The girl didn't move for a moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she processed his words. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. Micah reached in, his hands working quickly to untie the ropes around her wrists. They were red and raw, the skin chafed from hours of struggling. As he removed the gag from her mouth, the girl let out a shaky breath, but still didn't make a sound. She only clung to him, her small hands gripping his jacket like a lifeline. Her body was cold, and Micah could feel her trembling against him. "We need to move," he said, his voice low but firm. He scanned the alley again, every instinct on high alert. "Can you walk?" The girl nodded again, though her legs wobbled slightly as she climbed out of the trunk with his help. She held onto him tightly, her silence unnerving, but also filled with a quiet determination to follow his lead. Micah glanced back at the SUV, dread knotting in his stomach. Whoever had done this would come back, of that he was certain, and if they found her gone, they'd tear the city apart looking for her. Taking her hand, he whispered, "Stay close to me, okay? Don't let go." The girl's grip tightened, and together they slipped into the shadows of the alley. Each step was deliberate, each sound making Micah's heart race. The city around them felt hostile now, its usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive tension. He led her through narrow passageways, past dumpsters and graffiti-covered walls, his mind racing as he plotted their next move. There was no time to think about who she was or why she'd been left in that trunk. All that mattered was keeping her safe. The SUV still loomed in his peripheral vision, a silent reminder of the danger they had narrowly escaped. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning for any sign of the kidnappers. The street was eerily quiet, save for the hum of a distant engine and the occasional bark of a dog. The girl stumbled slightly, her bare feet scraping against the pavement. Micah stopped and crouched down to her level. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice laced with concern. She nodded, but didn't let go of his sleeve. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on him as though he were her last tether to safety. "What's your name?" he asked softly, but she only shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. Micah frowned, realizing she hadn't said a single word since he freed her from the trunk. He thought about the gag, the raw marks on her wrists, and the way she communicated through gestures. Could she speak at all? "We'll figure it out later," he murmured, standing back up. "Right now, we've got to get out of here." He guided her deeper into the maze-like alleys, his mind racing. The city felt more menacing than usual tonight, every shadow a potential threat. He had no idea where to go, but staying in one place wasn't an option. Whoever had taken her would be looking, and it wouldn't take long for them to realize she was gone. Micah led her to a small alcove behind an old brick building where the dim light from a flickering street lamp barely reached. He pressed his back against the wall and gestured for her to do the same. "Stay here," he whispered. "I need to check something." The girl's grip tightened on his sleeve, her eyes pleading with him not to leave. Micah hesitated, then crouched down again. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going far," he promised. "Just stay right here. I'll be back in a second." Reluctantly, she let go, her small frame trembling as she huddled against the wall. Micah peeked around the corner of the building, his pulse racing. In the distance, he spotted two figures emerging from the diner, their movements hurried and agitated. The kidnappers. One of them gestured angrily toward the SUV, while the other pulled out a phone, speaking into it with sharp, clipped words. Micah ducked back into the shadows, his mind spinning. They knew she was gone. He could feel the urgency radiating off them, even from this distance. They wouldn't stop until they found her. "We need to move," he whispered, returning to the girl. She looked up at him, her fear palpable but unspoken. Without waiting for her to respond, Micah took her hand and led her back into the labyrinth of alleys. They moved quickly but carefully, Micah's senses on high alert. Every sound, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant honk of a horn, felt amplified, each one sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. The girl followed silently, her small hand gripping his tightly. Micah stopped abruptly when they reached a chain-link fence blocking their path. The top was lined with rusted barbed wire, but there was a small gap at the bottom where the fence had been pulled loose. He crouched down and peered through, deciding it was their best option. "Okay," he said, turning to her. "We're gonna crawl through here. It's a little tight, but I'll go first and help you, all right?" She nodded, her trust in him unwavering despite the chaos they were in. Micah slid under the fence, the sharp edges of the wire snagging his jacket. Once he was through, he reached back for her. She hesitated for a moment, her wide eyes darting toward the distant sound of footsteps, heavy, purposeful, and growing closer. "Come on," Micah urged, his voice steady but urgent. "You can do it." With a deep breath, the girl crouched down and wriggled through the gap. Micah grabbed her hands, pulling her to her feet just as the footsteps grew louder. He glanced back through the fence and caught a glimpse of one of the kidnappers turning into the alley they had just left. "Run," he whispered, pulling her along as they darted into the shadows once more. They ran until Micah's lungs burned, weaving through alleys, jumping over puddles, and dodging piles of discarded debris. The girl kept pace as best she could, her breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. Micah glanced at her periodically, his concern growing. She was scared and exhausted, but she didn't complain or falter. Finally, they reached a quiet, abandoned lot on the edge of the neighborhood. The area was littered with rusted cars and overgrown weeds, but it was dark and secluded, safe for now. Micah led her to an old pickup truck with shattered windows and helped her climb inside. The cab smelled of mildew, but it was better than being out in the open. Micah sat down beside her, his back pressed against the cold metal. The girl huddled close, her small body trembling as she clung to his arm. Micah let out a shaky breath, the weight of everything finally hitting him. "Okay," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "I think we lost them." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and questioning. He managed a small, reassuring smile, though his mind was still racing. What now? He had no idea who she was or why she'd been taken. But he knew one thing for sure: the people who wanted her back wouldn't give up easily. As the night deepened, Micah stayed alert, his eyes scanning the dark lot for any sign of danger. The girl eventually drifted off, her head resting against his shoulder. Micah didn't move, didn't dare disturb her. He had no answers, no plan, but he did have one certainty. "I'll keep you safe," he whispered more to himself than to her. "No matter what." Micah didn't let himself relax for a moment, even as the quiet of the abandoned lot wrapped around them like a blanket. The little girl, her tiny frame pressed close to his side, seemed to find some comfort in the silence. Her breaths were soft, her eyes drooping shut after the ordeal they had just escaped, but Micah's instincts wouldn't let him rest. The memory of the men's hurried footsteps and angry shouts echoed in his head. And then he heard it, the faint crunch of gravel. Micah's body went rigid. He quickly placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, her small head snapping up in alarm. He brought a finger to his lips, motioning for her to stay quiet. Her wide eyes stared at him, silently asking what was wrong. Another crunch. Louder this time. Micah's mind raced. Had they tracked them here? He peeked over the edge of the truck cab they were hiding in, his heart pounding as he scanned the dark lot. Two figures moved cautiously among the rusted cars and weeds, their voices low but audible now. "Search everywhere," one of them growled. "They can't have gotten far." Micah clenched his jaw, adrenaline coursing through him. He leaned back down, meeting the girl's frightened gaze. She didn't make a sound, but her trembling hands gripped his sleeve tightly. "We have to move," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She nodded, her trust in him unshaken despite the fear in her eyes. Carefully, Micah led her out of the truck, keeping low to avoid being seen. The shadows became their allies as they crept through the lot, slipping between the hulks of abandoned cars. The men's voices grew closer, their flashlight beams sweeping across the ground. Micah's breath hitched as one of the beams skimmed over their hiding spot. He pressed the girl against a rusty sedan, shielding her with his body. The light lingered for a moment before moving on, and he exhaled silently, his mind racing for their next move. The fence. Micah's eyes locked on a chain-link fence at the edge of the lot. It was old and partially collapsed, the bottom section bent upward just enough for them to crawl through. He tapped the girl's shoulder and pointed. She nodded, her tiny hands gripping his tightly as they began to move again. Behind them, one of the men cursed loudly. "Over there!" Micah didn't look back. "Go!" he hissed, urging the girl toward the fence. They reached it in seconds, but each one felt like an eternity. Micah crouched down, lifting the loose section of the fence. "Crawl under," he whispered. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting toward the sound of footsteps closing in. Micah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You can do it. I'll be right behind you." She dropped to her knees and slid under the fence, her movements quick but careful. Once she was through, Micah pushed himself under, the sharp edges of the fence snagging on his jacket. He winced but didn't stop, his focus entirely on getting them out of sight. As soon as he was through, he grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her into the shadows of a narrow alley. The men's shouts echoed behind them, but the fence bought them precious seconds. Micah led her deeper into the maze of alleys, his mind working frantically. He knew these streets well. Every shortcut and hiding spot burned into his memory from years of surviving on them. But he also knew the men chasing them wouldn't give up easily. They slipped through a gap between two buildings, emerging onto a quieter street. Micah's sharp eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of danger. It was empty for now, but he didn't trust it. "This way," he said, tugging her along. The girl didn't protest, her steps quick and quiet as she followed him. They turned into another alley, this one cluttered with trash bins and broken pallets. Micah spotted an old wooden door slightly ajar at the back of a building. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. He pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. He winced, but stepped inside, pulling the girl with him. The air inside was musty, the faint scent of mold lingering. The room was small and filled with stacks of dusty boxes, but it would serve as a temporary hiding spot. Micah closed the door as quietly as he could, then crouched down to the girl's level. "We'll stay here for a little while," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. She nodded, her breathing still fast, but controlled. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small piece of chalk. Micah watched as she bent down, using the dusty floor as her canvas. The words she wrote were shaky but clear. "Thank you." Micah felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at her, her tear-streaked face filled with gratitude despite everything she'd been through. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "I couldn't just leave you there." She stared at him for a moment, then wrote again. "Why?" Micah hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but something about her, her fear, her vulnerability, had struck a chord deep inside him. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be alone, to have no one to turn to. "Because it's the right thing to do," he finally said, "and I promise I won't let anything happen to you." The girl's lips trembled, and for the first time, a small, hesitant smile appeared. It was fleeting, but it was there. The cold wind bit at Micah's cheeks as he led Maisie down the deserted street. Dawn was still hours away, and the city was shrouded in the kind of silence that only came in the dead of night. Maisie, her small hand tucked tightly into his, stayed close, her feet shuffling against the uneven pavement. Though they had evaded the kidnappers for now, Micah knew they needed somewhere safe to hide, a place where they wouldn't be found. He glanced at Maisie. Her face was pale, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but she kept moving without complaint. Micah's heart clenched. She was too young for this kind of fear, too young to know the kind of world that left kids like him and, apparently her, running for their lives. "We're almost there," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if she understood. Maisie didn't respond, but she gave a small nod, her trust in him unwavering. At the edge of the neighborhood, Micah spotted the outline of the old, abandoned house where he'd been staying for the past few weeks. The house was hidden behind overgrown hedges and a rusted gate that barely hung on its hinges. It had once been a cozy little home, but years of neglect had turned it into a ghost of its former self. Still, for someone like Micah, it was a safe haven. He pushed open the gate, the metal screeching loudly in the stillness. Maisie flinched, and Micah quickly motioned for her to follow him. They slipped inside the house, the faint scent of mildew and damp wood greeting them. It wasn't much, but it was home, for now. "Micah?" A voice, low but sharp, called from the shadows. Micah froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned to see Lucille Carter, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. Her wiry frame was wrapped in an oversized cardigan, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She held a broom tightly in her hands, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of Micah and the little girl clinging to his side. "What are you doing bringing someone here?" Lucille asked, her tone a mix of annoyance and concern. "You know I don't like strangers." Micah held up his hands defensively. "Wait, just listen. It's not what it looks like." Lucille's gaze shifted to Maisie, who was half hidden behind Micah. The girl's tear-streaked face and trembling hands seemed to soften Lucille's expression, though she didn't lower the broom. "She's in trouble," Micah explained, his voice steady but pleading. "I found her. They had her tied up in the trunk of a car. I couldn't just leave her there." Lucille's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her shock with a deep frown. "And now you've brought her here? What if someone's looking for her? You think I want trouble showing up on my doorstep?" "She's just a kid," Micah said, his voice rising slightly. "She didn't do anything wrong. Please, Lucille. She needs a place to stay, just for a little while." Lucille sighed heavily, lowering the broom. Her sharp eyes studied Maisie again, taking in the way the girl clung to Micah like a lifeline. The look of fear and exhaustion etched on her small face seemed to pierce through Lucille's defenses. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Lucille asked gently. Maisie didn't respond. Instead, she tightened her grip on Micah's arm and buried her face against his sleeve. Micah hesitated, then said, "I don't think she can talk." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "Can't talk or won't?" "I don't know," Micah admitted. "She hasn't said a word since I found her." Lucille exhaled, her shoulders slumping. "All right," she muttered. "She can stay, but just for a night. You hear me? I don't need more trouble than I already have." Micah nodded quickly. "Thank you, really." Lucille waved him off, already heading toward the kitchen. "Don't thank me yet. If anyone comes sniffing around here, I'm sending both of you packing." Micah turned to Maisie, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "See? We'll be okay now." Maisie looked up at him, her tired eyes filled with gratitude. Lucille returned with a blanket and a mug of steaming tea. She handed the blanket to Micah and knelt down to offer the tea to Maisie. "Here, drink this. It'll warm you up." Maisie hesitated, her gaze darting to Micah for reassurance. He nodded, and she carefully took the mug in her small hands, sipping the tea. A faint smile tugged at Lucille's lips as she watched the girl relax slightly. For the first time in hours, Micah felt a flicker of relief. Maisie was safe, for now. The next morning, the faint light of dawn filtered through the cracked, grime-streaked windows of the old house. The air was cool and damp, but it carried an unexpected comfort, the smell of sizzling eggs mixed with the faint aroma of burnt toast. In the quiet stillness, the sound of a pan scraping against a rusty stovetop echoed softly, accompanied by the occasional mutter from Lucille as she worked. "Stupid burner," she grumbled, adjusting the dial on the ancient gas stove that always seemed to flicker precariously. Despite the dilapidated surroundings, Lucille's determination shone through. She moved with purpose, balancing a spatula in one hand and a chipped coffee mug in the other. At the wobbly kitchen table, Micah sat hunched over, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The uneven legs of the table creaked slightly as he leaned forward, watching Maisie. She sat across from him, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her wide eyes darting between him and Lucille, as if trying to figure out what came next. Her dress was still wrinkled and stained from the night before, but she didn't seem to care. For the first time, there was a hint of curiosity in her expression, replacing the fear that had gripped her just hours ago. Lucille shuffled to the table, balancing two mismatched plates piled with scrambled eggs and a few crusty slices of toast. She set them down with a slight huff, wiping her hands on a threadbare towel before retreating to the stove. "Eat while it's hot," she said, her tone gruff but not unkind. Micah hesitated for a moment before grabbing a piece of toast. It was slightly overdone, the edges blackened, but he didn't care. He tore into it hungrily, his stomach finally given the relief it craved. Across the table, Maisie stared at her plate, her hands still resting in her lap. Micah paused mid-bite, his brow furrowing. "You should eat," he said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. Maisie's gaze flicked up to meet his, then shifted back to the food. Slowly, she reached out and picked up a piece of toast, holding it delicately as if it might crumble in her hands. She took a tentative bite, and then another. Her eyes widened slightly, and, for the first time, a tiny smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Lucille, watching from the stove, raised an eyebrow. "You like it, huh?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough warmth to make Maisie look up. Maisie nodded enthusiastically, her cheeks puffed out like a squirrel's as she chewed. A small giggle escaped her lips, a soft, breathy sound that felt almost foreign in the quiet kitchen. Micah froze, his toast halfway to his mouth. It was the first sound he'd heard from her, and it was so unexpected, so light and joyful, that it made his chest tighten. He couldn't help but smile back at her, the tension from the past night momentarily lifting. Lucille turned back to the stove, muttering something under her breath, but the corners of her mouth twitched upward. She grabbed a third plate and slid the remaining eggs onto it before joining them at the table. The three sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the clinking of forks against plates and the soft creak of the unstable table. After they'd finished eating, Lucille stood and rummaged through a drawer near the sink, pulling out an old, battered deck of cards. "Here," she said, tossing it onto the table with a grin. "Let's see if you kids can keep up." Maisie's eyes sparkled as she picked up the cards, shuffling through them clumsily but eagerly. Lucille pulled a chair closer, sitting beside Maisie and guiding her hands with surprising gentleness. Micah watched from his spot at the table, leaning back slightly as he let himself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. The game was simple, just a child's version of Go Fish, but the room filled with an easy warmth as Maisie's silent laughter lit up the space. She didn't need to speak. The way her eyes crinkled with delight and her shoulders shook with suppressed giggles said everything. Lucille, too, seemed different. Her usual sharp edges softened as she gently teased Maisie about holding too many cards, or congratulated her on winning a round. For a brief moment, the house didn't feel abandoned or broken. It felt alive. Micah's gaze shifted between the two of them. Lucille's gruff kindness, Maisie's timid but growing confidence. They were creating something he hadn't felt in years, something that made the cold walls and the peeling paint of the house seem less important. Maisie, sitting between them, scribbled something on a piece of paper she'd found earlier. She held it up for them to see. Family. Lucille's eyes softened, and Micah felt a lump in his throat. For the first time in a long while, the word didn't feel so far away. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant rustle of leaves brushing against the windows. The afternoon sun cast long, golden beams through the cracked panes, illuminating the dust motes swirling in the air. Lucille was seated at the kitchen table, her arms crossed as she studied Maisie, who sat opposite her, with a pencil clutched tightly in her small hand. Micah lingered nearby, leaning against the wall, his eyes flicking between the two. "All right," Lucille said, her tone softer than usual, but still edged with a hint of impatience. If you can't talk, maybe you can write. Let's start with your name." Slowly, Maisie began to write on the piece of paper Lucille had placed in front of her. Her strokes were shaky but deliberate, and when she finished, she pushed the paper across the table. Maisie. Lucille read the name aloud, her eyebrows lifting slightly. Maisie, huh? That's a pretty name. She glanced at Micah. At least now we're not calling her, "Hey, kid." Maisie's lips quirked into a brief, shy smile before she lowered her gaze again. Lucille slid the paper back toward her. "Okay, Maisie. Can you tell us where you're from? Anything about your family?" Maisie froze, her pencil hovering above the paper. Her small shoulders tensed, and for a moment, Micah thought she wasn't going to respond. But then, slowly, she began to write again. The letters came out messier this time, her hand trembling as she worked. When she finally pushed the paper forward, the words made Lucille's frown deepen. "Big house. Nobody there." Lucille glanced at Micah, her expression a mix of concern and confusion. "What's that supposed to mean?" Micah stepped closer, crouching down beside Maisie. "Do you mean your family's not there?" he asked gently. Maisie nodded, her movements slow and deliberate. She set the pencil down and began to gesture, her small hands moving quickly in the air. It took a moment for Micah and Lucille to realize she was miming, a door opening, footsteps leaving, and then a long pause, as though she were waiting for something. Lucille leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply. "Her parents aren't around," she said, her voice heavy. "Bet they're too busy with whatever rich people nonsense they've got going on." Micah's jaw tightened. He didn't know why, but hearing Lucille say it out loud made his chest ache. Maisie's wide, empty house wasn't so different from the lonely streets he'd called home. Money didn't make you feel any less alone. Maisie picked up the pencil again, her strokes quicker this time, as if she were desperate to explain. When she slid the paper forward, it read, "Always working, don't see them." Micah swallowed hard, glancing at Lucille. The older woman's eyes softened, though her mouth remained set in a firm line. She looked at Maisie, her tone gentler now. "So, they leave you alone a lot, huh?" Maisie nodded, her lower lip trembling. She wrote a single word next. "Sad." The silence in the room was deafening. Micah reached out and rested a hand on Maisie's shoulder, his touch light but steady. "You're not alone now," he said quietly. "We're here." Maisie looked up at him, her eyes glistening. She didn't cry, but the gratitude in her expression was unmistakable. As the day wore on, Lucille grew more insistent. "We can't keep her here forever," she said, her voice hushed as she spoke to Micah in the corner of the kitchen. "This isn't just some stray cat you picked up. She's a little girl. Her parents are probably worried sick." Micah's jaw clenched. "Her parents don't care, Lucille. You saw what she wrote. They're never around." "That doesn't mean we can just keep her," Lucille shot back. "She's not ours to take care of." "She doesn't want to go back," Micah said, his voice rising slightly. "And I don't blame her. You think I'm just going to hand her over to some strangers who don't even care about her?" Lucille sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, I get it, all right? But this is bigger than you, Micah. The cops are probably out there looking for her right now, and what happens if those men, the ones who had her, come back? Do you really want to put her in danger again?" Micah didn't respond, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He knew Lucille was right, but the thought of Maisie being sent back to that empty house, back to parents who didn't even notice when she was gone, made his stomach turn. Maisie, who had been listening quietly from the table, suddenly stood. She grabbed the pencil and paper and wrote quickly, her strokes sharp and deliberate. When she finished, she held it up for them to see. "I stay, please." Lucille stared at the words, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, the room was silent. That night, as darkness fell over the city, Lucille finally relented. "She can stay," she said gruffly, avoiding Micah's gaze. "For now, but we're going to have to figure something out." Micah nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you." Lucille waved him off. "Don't thank me yet. If anything happens, it's on you." Micah glanced at Maisie, who was sitting on the couch, clutching a worn blanket Lucille had given her. Her small face lit up when she caught his eye, and he managed a smile in return. Maisie began to change in ways that surprised even herself. The fear that had once clung to her like a shadow, always in her eyes, always in her movements, began to lift. It didn't happen all at once, but in small, quiet moments. A hesitant smile here, a spark of curiosity there. And slowly that fear was replaced by something new. A quiet confidence nurtured by the unlikely companionship she had found with Micah and Lucille. One crisp morning, as the autumn sun cast a golden glow over the overgrown backyard, Maisie and Micah prepared for one of their expeditions, as Lucille teasingly called them. Their routine had developed naturally, born out of necessity. While Lucille provided what little she could from her meager savings, Micah took it upon himself to contribute, scrounging for scrap metal, discarded cans, or anything else that could be sold for a few dollars. Maisie, eager to help, insisted on tagging along. Micah glanced down at her as they walked along the edge of a cracked sidewalk, her small hand firmly gripping his. She was bundled up in one of Lucille's old sweaters, the sleeves rolled up several times over her tiny wrists. The sweater swallowed her whole, but she didn't seem to mind. She carried a tattered canvas bag slung over her shoulder, ready to collect whatever treasures they might find. "You sure you want to come?" Micah asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's not exactly fun." Maisie tilted her head, her expression stubborn. She didn't need words to make her point. With a small huff, she tugged on his sleeve, urging him forward. All right, Micah said with a grin. "You're the boss." Their first stop was the alley behind a row of shops. It wasn't glamorous, far from it, but Micah knew from experience that the dumpsters here often held discarded cardboard, broken electronics, and the occasional bundle of cans. As they reached the first bin, Micah propped it open, peering inside. "Bingo!" he muttered, spotting a stack of aluminum cans. He pulled himself up, half disappearing into the dumpster, as he began to toss the cans into Maisie's bag. Maisie stood on tiptoes, her arms stretched as she tried to catch each one. Her concentration was fierce, her nose scrunching slightly every time she missed and had to pick up a can from the ground. By the time Micah jumped down, her bag was nearly full. "You're a natural," Micah said, ruffling her hair. Maisie beamed up at him, her silent laugh lighting up her face. They moved on to another alley, then another. Micah kept an eye on Maisie the entire time, watching for any sign of discomfort or fear. But Maisie seemed to thrive in these moments, her small hands eagerly searching through piles of discarded items, her excitement growing with each little discovery. At one point, she found a rusted tin box buried beneath some old newspapers. She held it up to Micah, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What's that?" he asked, taking the box from her and flipping it open. Inside was a tangle of old coins, the kind that probably weren't worth much but looked cool enough to keep. Micah handed it back to her. "You can keep this one, a souvenir." Maisie grinned and tucked the box into her bag, clutching it like a prized treasure. By mid-afternoon, they were both tired and hungry. Micah led Maisie to the back of a nearby diner, where the smells of sizzling burgers and fries wafted through the air. Maisie's stomach growled audibly, and she looked up at Micah with wide, pleading eyes. "Don't worry," he said, crouching beside her. "We'll find something." Micah knew the owner of the diner, a gruff but kind-hearted man who didn't mind if a couple of kids took leftovers from the bins, so long as they didn't make a mess. Micah opened one of the trash bags carefully, scanning its contents. His eyes lit up when he spotted a nearly untouched sandwich, still wrapped in wax paper, and a handful of fries in a grease-stained box. He handed the sandwich to Maisie, who unwrapped it eagerly and took a small, tentative bite. Her face lit up, and she offered him a piece, holding it out like a peace offering. "Nah, you eat," Micah said, grinning. "I've got these." He held up the box of fries, popping one into his mouth. It was cold and soggy, but it was better than nothing. They sat together on an overturned crate, sharing their makeshift meal in comfortable silence. Maisie kicked her legs back and forth, her eyes darting around the alley as if it were a magical new world. Micah watched her, a strange warmth settling in his chest. She didn't seem like the same scared little girl he had pulled from that trunk. Here, in the middle of a dirty alley, eating cold fries and a leftover sandwich, Maisie looked happy, and for Micah, that was enough. The walk back to Lucille's house was slow and meandering, the weight of their finds dragging them down, but not dampening their spirits. Maisie swung her bag over her shoulder, humming a tuneless melody as they passed a group of children playing hopscotch on the sidewalk. One of the kids paused to stare at her, but Maisie simply waved, her confidence unshaken. Micah couldn't help but smile. He had worried in those early days that Maisie might never feel safe again. But here she was, proving him wrong in the best possible way. By the time they reached the house, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the broken fence and overgrown yard. Lucille was waiting for them on the porch, her arms crossed but her expression soft. "Find anything good?" she called as they approached. "Loads," Micah said, dropping his bag with a dramatic groan. "And I think Maisie found a new favorite hobby." Maisie grinned, holding up the tin box she'd found earlier. Lucille raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Well, don't just stand there," she said, motioning toward the house. "Get cleaned up before dinner. You're both filthy." Maisie darted inside, her laughter silent but infectious. Micah followed, pausing on the porch to glance back at Lucille. "Thanks," he said quietly. Lucille waved him off, her voice gruff as ever. "Don't thank me yet, kid. Just keep her out of trouble." Micah nodded, stepping inside as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. For now, everything felt okay. Not perfect, but good enough. And sometimes, good enough was all you needed. The peaceful routine shattered one afternoon. Maisie was playing outside, her laughter silent but bright as she chased a stray butterfly near the edge of the yard. Micah was working on repairing a broken step on the porch, glancing up every few minutes to make sure she stayed close. Then he saw it, a police car slowly cruising down the street. Micah froze, his heart pounding. The car wasn't supposed to be there. This street was always quiet, the kind of place no one paid attention to. Maisie, unaware of the danger, continued chasing the butterfly until it landed on the edge of the sidewalk. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the delicate wings as they fluttered. The car slowed, and the officer inside rolled down his window. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his tone friendly but curious. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" Micah dropped the hammer he'd been holding and bolted toward her. "Maisie!" he hissed, grabbing her hand and pulling her back toward the house. The officer frowned, stepping out of the car. "Hold on a second," he said, his voice firmer now. "Is everything okay here?" Lucille appeared in the doorway, her expression calm but sharp. "Everything's fine, officer," she said smoothly. "The girl's my niece. She's just playing." The officer's gaze shifted between Lucille, Micah, and Maisie, his suspicion clear. "Your niece, huh?" he said. "Funny, I don't remember seeing you folks around here before." "We keep to ourselves," Lucille replied, her tone steady. "Is there a problem?" The officer hesitated, then shook his head. "Not unless you make it one," he said. "But you tell your niece to stay away from the street. Not safe for kids to be out here alone." Lucille nodded curtly. "Will do." The officer lingered for a moment before getting back into his car and driving off. As soon as he was out of sight, Lucille turned to Micah, her eyes blazing. "What were you thinking, letting her play that close to the street?" Micah opened his mouth to protest, but Lucille held up a hand. "Save it," she snapped. "We're lucky that cop didn't ask more questions. Next time, we might not be so lucky." Maisie, sensing the tension, clung to Micah's arm, her face pale. Micah crouched down beside her, his voice soft. "It's okay," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong, but we have to be more careful, all right?" Maisie nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She scribbled something quickly on her notepad and held it up. "I'm sorry." Micah hugged her tightly. "Don't be. It's not your fault." Lucille sighed, her anger fading as she watched the two of them. "We're gonna have to figure something out," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. That night, as Maisie slept curled up on the couch, Micah and Lucille sat in the kitchen, their voices low. "They're looking for her," Lucille said. "I can feel it. The longer we keep her here, the more danger we're in." Micah's jaw tightened. "We can't just send her back. You saw how scared she was. She doesn't want to go home." Lucille rubbed her temples. "We're not equipped to handle this, Micah. Sooner or later, someone's going to come knocking. And then what?" Micah didn't answer. He didn't know what the right thing to do was anymore. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow over the bustling room. Officers moved about with papers in hand, the sound of phones ringing and quiet conversations filling the air. Maisie sat on a hard plastic chair, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized police jacket draped over her shoulders. She clung to Micah's arm, her wide, frightened eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. Micah sat beside her, his leg bouncing nervously. His worn jacket felt suffocating under the watchful gazes of the officers, who occasionally glanced their way. Lucille stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly as she leaned against the wall, her face carefully blank, but her sharp eyes scanning the room. They had been brought in after a second encounter with the police. Lucille had insisted that if they cooperated, they could explain the situation. But Micah wasn't so sure. The knot in his stomach tightened as he watched an officer approach them, a clipboard in hand. "Micah Harris?" the officer asked, his tone brisk. Micah nodded, his throat dry. "We've contacted the Whitmores," the officer said, his gaze shifting to Maisie. "They're on their way. Shouldn't be long now." Maisie stiffened, her grip on Micah's arm tightening. She shook her head vehemently, her silent protest clear. Micah leaned closer to her, whispering, "It's okay. You'll be safe with them." But Maisie's eyes filled with tears, and she clung to him even tighter. She scribbled quickly on the pad of paper Lucille had handed her earlier. "I don't want to go. Please." Micah's chest ached as he read the words. He didn't know what to say. How could he promise her things would be okay when he didn't believe it himself? The tension in the room grew thicker when the double doors of the station opened, revealing a tall, sharply dressed man and a woman in an elegant but disheveled coat. Their presence seemed to command attention, officers nodding respectfully as they passed. Nathaniel Whitmore strode forward, his piercing gaze landing on Maisie. His wife, Margaret, hurried behind him, her face pale and drawn with worry. "Maisie!" Margaret cried, rushing to her daughter. She dropped to her knees in front of the chair, pulling Maisie into a tight embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she stroked her daughter's hair, her voice trembling. "Oh, my baby! We've been so worried!" Maisie didn't respond. Her body was stiff, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her eyes, filled with apprehension, flicked to Micah. Nathaniel stood behind his wife, his expression stern as he looked at his daughter. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice clipped but edged with concern. Maisie shook her head, but didn't meet his gaze. Nathaniel's attention shifted to Micah, his sharp eyes narrowing. "And who are you?" Micah opened his mouth to respond, but his voice faltered. He wasn't sure how to explain. Before he could say anything, Maisie picked up her notepad and scribbled furiously. She held it up for her father to see. "He saved me." Nathaniel's brow furrowed as he read the words. He turned back to Micah, his tone skeptical. "Is that true?" "Yes, sir," Micah said, his voice steady now. "I found her. She was, in a bad situation. I just wanted to make sure she was safe." Margaret looked up from Maisie, her tear-filled eyes softening as she glanced at Micah. "You saved her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Micah nodded, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "I couldn't just leave her. She needed help." Nathaniel's skepticism didn't waver. He crossed his arms, his gaze cold. "And why, exactly, were you around when she needed help? A kid like you, hanging around alleys?" "Hey!" Lucille's voice cut through the tension as she stepped forward. Her glare was sharp enough to rival Nathaniel's. "This boy put himself in danger to protect your daughter. You might want to show a little gratitude." Nathaniel turned his icy stare to Lucille. "And who are you?" "A concerned citizen," she snapped. "Someone who's seen a lot more of life than you, I'd bet." Micah winced, but he couldn't help feeling a small flicker of gratitude for Lucille's defense. As the adults argued, Maisie's small hand slipped into Micah's. He looked down to see her staring up at him, tears welling in her eyes. She tugged on his sleeve, then held up the notepad again. "Don't leave me." Micah felt like the air had been knocked out of him. "Maisie," he whispered, crouching down to meet her gaze. "They're your family. They can give you things I can't, a real home." Maisie shook her head fiercely, her tears spilling over. She wrote again, her strokes fast and shaky. "You are my family." Micah swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He wanted to tell her he felt the same, that he would stay by her side no matter what. But the truth loomed over him like a shadow. This wasn't his decision to make. "Maisie," Margaret said gently, pulling her daughter closer. "We're going to take you home. You'll be safe with us, I promise." Maisie didn't respond. Her small body shook with silent sobs as she clung to Micah. As the tension reached its peak, an officer stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, we need to ask you a few questions before you leave. Just standard procedure." Nathaniel nodded curtly, his gaze lingering on Micah. "Fine, but I want answers about this boy and why he was with my daughter." Margaret hesitated, glancing between Maisie and Micah. "She seems attached to him," she said softly. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I don't like it." Micah stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not trying to take her from you," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I just wanted to keep her safe. That's all." Nathaniel didn't respond, his expression unreadable. Lucille stepped forward, placing a hand on Micah's shoulder. "This boy has a better heart than most people I've met," she said. "And if your daughter feels safe with him, maybe you should ask yourself why." The ride to the Whitmore estate was steeped in a tense silence. Maisie sat wedged between Micah and her mother in the back seat of a sleek black car, her small hands clutching Micah's tightly. Margaret occasionally glanced over at her daughter, her lips pressed into a thin line, as though unsure how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. In the driver's seat, Nathaniel Whitmore kept his focus on the road, his jaw tight, his mind clearly racing with unspoken thoughts. Lucille sat in the front passenger seat, her sharp eyes scanning the passing scenery. She had agreed to accompany Micah only after Maisie's silent pleas and Margaret's cautious invitation. "A few days," Margaret had said, her tone hesitant but sincere, to give her time to adjust. For Maisie, it was non-negotiable. She had written her demand plainly on a notepad at the station. "Micah comes with me." Nathaniel hadn't been pleased, but Margaret had relented, perhaps out of guilt or simply a desire to ease her daughter's obvious distress. When they arrived at the estate, Maisie led the way, her small hand still gripping Micah's as they stepped into the grand foyer. The house was enormous, its high ceilings and gleaming marble floors a stark contrast to the humble, cluttered safety of Lucille's home. Micah couldn't help but feel out of place, his worn sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished floor. Maisie pulled him forward, leading him through the lavishly decorated hall to the family room. She gestured toward a plush sofa, urging him to sit. He hesitated, glancing around as though afraid of breaking something. Margaret knelt beside Maisie, her voice soft. "Maisie, sweetheart, you're home now. We'll take care of you." But Maisie shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. She picked up her notepad from the coffee table and scribbled quickly, thrusting it toward her mother. "Help Micah too." Margaret blinked, taken aback. "Maisie, what do you mean?" Maisie gestured emphatically, her hands moving with urgency as she pointed to Micah, then back to herself. Finally, she wrote again, her strokes slower but deliberate. "He saved me. He needs a family too." Nathaniel, who had been lingering near the doorway, let out a sharp sigh. "Maisie, this isn't—" But Margaret held up a hand, silencing him. She turned to Micah, her expression softening. "Is that true?" Micah shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't do it for anything," he mumbled. "I just couldn't leave her." Maisie stepped closer to him, her small hands resting on his shoulder. Her wide eyes locked onto her father's, silently pleading. Nathaniel hesitated, his stern facade cracking ever so slightly under her gaze. "Fine," he said finally, his voice gruff. "He can stay. For now." The next few days at the Whitmore estate were unlike anything Micah or Lucille had ever experienced. The staff, though polite, regarded them with thinly veiled curiosity. Micah's awkwardness was palpable as he tried to navigate the opulence around him. The dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and polished silverware, felt more like a museum than a place to eat. Maisie, however, thrived in the comfort of her home. Though she rarely left Micah's side, she introduced him to her favorite books in the library, dragged him to the garden to show him her secret hideaways, and even convinced him to join her for tea in the sunroom. Her laughter, though silent, filled the house with a warmth it had been missing for far too long. Lucille, ever the practical one, made herself useful by helping the housekeeper in the kitchen. "Don't need to sit around twiddling my thumbs," she muttered when Margaret protested. Micah struggled to adjust. The staff's polite smiles and Nathaniel's scrutinizing stares made him feel like an intruder. He spent most of his time in the garden with Maisie, where he could breathe a little easier. One evening, Micah found himself standing awkwardly in the dining room as the family prepared for dinner. The table was set with pristine china and sparkling glassware, the kind of setup Micah had only ever seen in magazines. "Take a seat," Margaret said warmly, motioning to an empty chair. Micah hesitated, glancing at Lucille, who gave him a subtle nod. He sat down slowly, his shoulders tense. Nathaniel, seated at the head of the table, watched him carefully. "So, Micah," he said, his tone measured, "where exactly are you from?" Micah looked down at his plate, unsure how to answer. "Nowhere, really," he said finally. "I've been on my own for a while." Maisie reached across the table and tapped his arm, giving him an encouraging smile. "Is that how you ended up finding Maisie?" Margaret asked gently. Micah nodded. "Yeah, I was just in the right place at the right time, I guess." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Maisie, clearly sensing the tension, picked up her notepad and wrote something quickly. She held it up for everyone to see. "Micah is my hero." The room fell silent. Margaret's eyes softened, and even Nathaniel seemed momentarily taken aback. Lucille, sensing an opportunity, cleared her throat. "This boy's been through more than most people his age," she said, "and he's still got the heart to do what's right. That's more than I can say for a lot of folks." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting between Maisie and Micah. "We'll see," he said finally. Over time, Nathaniel began to thaw, though his change was slow and cautious. He started joining Maisie and Micah in the garden, watching from a distance as they played or read together. He even asked Micah about his interests one evening, though the conversation was brief and awkward. Maisie seemed determined to bring everyone closer together. She insisted on family game nights, dragging Nathaniel into the living room and making him play cards with Micah and Lucille. Her joy was contagious, and for a little while, the lines between their vastly different worlds began to blur. Micah still felt out of place, but Maisie's unwavering trust in him gave him the strength to stay. Slowly but surely, the house began to feel less like a stranger's mansion and more like a home. The Whitmore estate, once an imposing and distant structure, began to feel more alive. The clinking of dishes in the kitchen, the soft murmur of voices in the living room, and Maisie's silent laughter filled the previously hollow halls. For the first time in years, the house wasn't just a showcase of wealth. It was a home. Nathaniel Whitmore sat in his office, surrounded by towering stacks of papers and glowing screens. The familiar hum of work buzzed in the air, yet his thoughts were elsewhere. Through the window, he could see Micah and Maisie in the garden, their heads bent close as they inspected a line of flowers. Maisie's gestures were animated, her silent joy unmistakable, while Micah listened with unwavering attention, a grin spreading across his face. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering. For years he had convinced himself that providing for his family was enough, that his long hours at the office justified his absence at home. But watching Micah with Maisie had stirred something in him. The boy who had grown up with so little had given Maisie more love and attention in a few weeks than Nathaniel had managed in years. The realization was sharp and unsettling. Later that evening, Nathaniel found himself sitting in the living room with Margaret. She was flipping through a photo album, her fingers tracing the edges of pictures of a younger Maisie. "She's happy," Margaret said softly, glancing up at him. Nathaniel nodded. "She is. Happier than I've seen her in a long time." Margaret closed the album, her expression thoughtful. "It's because of Micah." Nathaniel didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, "I don't know how he does it. She's been through so much, and yet—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "He sees her," Margaret said simply. "Not the quiet, perfect little girl we've tried to raise. He sees the real her." Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've spent my whole life working to give her everything, and it still wasn't enough." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle. "Maybe it's time to give her what she really needs. Us." A few days later, Nathaniel called Micah into his office. The boy entered cautiously, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his posture stiff. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing briefly on the framed awards and certificates lining the walls before meeting Nathaniel's gaze. "You wanted to see me?" Micah asked, his voice steady but wary. Nathaniel gestured to the chair opposite him. Sit down, Micah. Micah hesitated, but eventually sat, his shoulders still tense. Nathaniel leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, he began. About Maisie, about you, about this family. Micah shifted in his seat, unsure where the conversation was headed. I'll admit, Nathaniel continued, I wasn't sure about you at first. I questioned your intentions, your background. But I've seen how you are with Maisie, how you've brought her out of her shell, made her smile again. And it's clear to me now that you've become an important part of her life. Micah blinked, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. What are you saying? Nathaniel took a deep breath. What I'm saying is that I want to give you a real chance, a home. If you're willing, Margaret and I would like to adopt you. Micah stared at him, his mouth slightly open. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. The word adoption felt almost foreign, like something that happened in fairy tales, but not in real life, not to someone like him. You want to adopt me? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel nodded. We do. Maisie isn't the only one who's grown attached. You've shown me what it means to be present, to care for the people who matter, and I think this family would be better with you in it. Micah's throat tightened, and he looked down at his hands. I don't know, he said after a moment. I'm not sure I'd fit in here. Nathaniel's voice softened. Micah, you already do. You've proven that over and over again. Micah glanced up, meeting Nathaniel's steady gaze. For the first time, he saw something in the man's eyes that he hadn't expected. Sincerity. I need to think about it, Micah said finally. Nathaniel nodded. Take all the time you need. Later that evening, Micah sat on the back porch steps, staring out at the darkened garden. The stars above were faint, their light barely cutting through the city's glow. Lucille joined him, lowering herself onto the step beside him with a soft groan. Big decision, huh? She said, breaking the silence. Micah nodded. Yeah. Lucille lit a cigarette, the ember glowing faintly in the darkness. She exhaled a thin stream of smoke, her gaze fixed on the horizon. You know, not many people get a second chance like this, she said. A real family, a place to belong. It's a rare thing. Micah looked at her, his brow furrowed. What about you? You've been like family to me. Lucille chuckled softly. I'm an old lady, Micah. I've made my peace with the life I've got. Doesn't mean I'm going anywhere, though. I'll always be around when you need me. Micah nodded, his chest tightening with gratitude. The next morning, Micah made his decision. Sitting around the breakfast table with the Whitmores, he took a deep breath and said, I'd like to stay, if you'll have me. Maisie clapped silently, her face lighting up with joy. Margaret reached over, placing a gentle hand on Micah's. Welcome home, she said, her voice warm. Nathaniel, though reserved as always, gave Micah a small nod. We're glad to have you. Lucille, watching from the doorway, smiled faintly. She knew her place in Micah's life had shifted, but she was content. She had done what she could to guide him, and now it was time for him to start a new chapter. Micah adjusted his suit jacket with trembling hands, the crisp fabric a far cry from the hand-me-down clothes he'd once scavenged to survive. He stood near the edge of the garden, his gaze scanning the growing crowd of family and friends, their smiles brimming with anticipation. He couldn't help but reflect on the boy he had been 10 years ago, a wanderer with no home, no family, and no direction. And yet, here he was, waiting for the love of his life. Behind him, Nathaniel Whitmore approached, his usual stoic demeanor softened by pride. You look sharp, son, he said, clapping Micah on the shoulder. Micah offered a nervous smile. Thanks. Not bad for a kid who used to patch his clothes with duct tape, right? Nathaniel chuckled, his eyes shining. You've come a long way, Micah, and I couldn't be prouder of you and Maisie. Micah swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. Thanks for believing in me, he said quietly. Nathaniel's smile widened, a rare but genuine expression of approval. Always. The murmur of the crowd stilled as the first notes of soft music drifted through the garden. All heads turned toward the path, where Maisie appeared, her arm gently linked with Margaret's. She moved with a quiet confidence, her flowing white dress catching the golden light with every step. Her hair was adorned with a crown of delicate flowers, and her eyes shimmered with unshed tears of joy. Micah's breath caught as he watched her approach, each step bringing her closer. Maisie had always been beautiful to him, but today she was radiant beyond words, a vision that seemed to glow with love and hope. Her gaze locked onto his, and in that moment, the rest of the world faded away. When she reached him, Margaret released Maisie's hand with a tearful smile, gently placing it in Micah's. "Take care of her," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I will," Micah promised, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Lucille, seated proudly in the front row, dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. "I told them," she muttered to no one in particular. "I always knew those two were meant for something special." The officiant, a close family friend, began the ceremony, weaving a story of love, resilience, and the power of second chances. Though Maisie could not speak her vows, she had prepared a small notebook, her handwriting precise and heartfelt. She held it up for Micah to read, her eyes glimmering with joy. "I don't need words to tell you how much I love you. You've been my hero, my best friend, and now my partner. Forever." Micah's chest tightened as he fought back tears. Taking her hands in his, he met her gaze with unshakable certainty. "Maisie," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "you've shown me what it means to belong. You've taught me love, hope, and the kind of strength I never knew I had. I promise to stand by you, to love you, and to cherish you, always." The officiant smiled warmly, pronouncing them husband and wife. As the crowd erupted into cheers, Micah leaned down, brushing his lips softly against Maisie's. It was a kiss filled with every word they had ever spoken and every promise they would keep. The reception was a joyous blur of laughter, music, and celebration. Beneath the fairy lights, guests mingled and danced, their voices carrying through the crisp evening air. Lucille, in her usual spirited fashion, took to the dance floor with Maisie, their uncoordinated waltz drawing laughter and applause from the crowd. Even Nathaniel, ever composed, allowed himself a rare chuckle as he watched them twirl. Micah found himself surrounded by friends and family, their words of congratulations blending into a symphony of love and admiration. Every handshake, every embrace felt surreal, a reminder of how far he had come. Later, as the celebration wound down and the garden grew quieter, Micah and Maisie slipped away to the steps of the estate. The glow of the lights behind them cast soft shadows, while the distant murmur of laughter and music added a gentle backdrop. Maisie leaned her head against Micah's shoulder, her small hand resting lightly in his. She reached for her notepad, scribbling a single word before holding it up for him to see. "Home." Micah's chest tightened as he read the word. He turned to her, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah," he whispered, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "We finally made it." The stars began to peek through the night sky as they sat together, their laughter blending with the rustle of the evening breeze. In that moment, with the world at peace around them, they knew their journey had led them exactly where they were meant to be, a life of love, hope, and the family they had always dreamed of. As Micah and Maisie sat together under the glow of the fairy lights, their journey reminds us all of the extraordinary power of love, resilience, and kindness. This story is more than a tale of romance. It's a testament to how a simple act of courage can ripple outward, changing lives in ways we never expect. From a chance encounter in an alleyway to building a family rooted in trust and understanding, Micah and Maisie's journey shows us that no matter where we come from, love can lead us to where we truly belong. But what about you? What do you think about Micah's decision to embrace a life so different from the one he knew? How would you have handled the challenges he faced? And if you were in Maisie's shoes, what would family mean to you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your perspective on what stood out to you most in this story. If this tale of love and redemption resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the beauty in unexpected connections. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our next heartwarming adventure. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.